There's a trend in contemporary education, and I think it's an unfortunate trend. It comes out of the progressive movement that had its heyday in the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And this trend argues that students ought to be acquainted with real life, and the materials that they read, the things they study, ought to reflect real life. The problem, of course, with that, at least in part, is that it can be difficult to define real life, but a bigger problem with that is that it often eliminates the imagination, which is essential for a full apprehension of the life that we live and understanding concepts such as moral philosophy and political philosophy. And consequently, this trend usually pushes educators to dumb down the material that students are reading. So it's an unfortunate movement in education, and I think students more than anyone are the ones who suffer from that. What does that have to do with comics and graphic novels? Well, by the nature of the genre, comics are, I think we could say, they're cartoonish. They distort reality. They distort reality in a number of different ways. And if a comic or graphic novel is especially artistic, then it's going to bend reality in such a way as to support not only a storyline, but also a particular philosophical attitude. I think we can appreciate this if we just put it in the context of literature and the fine arts. So, for example, some of the most beautiful painting and some of the most evocative painting comes from the French Impressionists. Obviously, there's no attempt to achieve a kind of verisimilitude with that painting. Rather, it's an attempt to convey a mood, to convey an attitude toward life, and it's a way of making life more beautiful and also making life more complex because of the techniques that are involved in French Impressionism. We might consider the painting of the Spanish painter Francisco de Goya. Goya's painting is distorted in a couple of different directions. Some speculate that it's because he had some bipolar tendencies, but even if he did, that seemed to fuel his creativity, and he was able to show us some sides of life that perhaps are more difficult to apprehend. For example, some of his paintings, absolutely beautiful in their depiction of common life and the use of color and just the ordinary situations that are portrayed in the painting. It's at least as beautiful as French Impressionism in all of its aspects. On the other hand, Goya could swing as with a pendulum and paint with a mood that was entirely different. Now, some of this seemed to have been provoked by the French invasion of Spain in the 19th century, what the Spanish tend to call La Guerra de Independencia, the war for independence. And Goya portrayed the horrors of that war in ways that are unforgettable. One gruesome scene after another, and oftentimes Goya did nothing but entitle those pictures, "I saw this, I also saw this." And then he's got a very famous painting. Depending on the translation, it's Saturn or Mars eating his children. And the theme and the lesson is that war will always consume those who are involved in it. There is no escaping that. Just a couple of other examples. Salvador Dali and the surrealism of his paintings. But you can't look at those paintings without appreciating that he is distorting reality, bending it, melting it at times, but he's conveying something to us that we might not be able to understand otherwise. And then we could talk about the Cubist painters as well, who in a sense deconstructed life, changed the dimensions of life, and once again that's teaching us something about life. Turning to literature, just a couple of examples. The American Southern writer Flannery O'Connor wrote in what many have called a cartoonish matter. Now, in trying to explain trying to convey her style. On a couple of occasions, she compared her work to that of Czechoslovakian writer Franz Kafka, whose work is also very distorted. In O'Connor's writing, people are always getting killed, or at least they are the victims of violence. But O'Connor is trying to portray and to explain something very, very difficult to us, and that is that we all need self-knowledge. We need to understand ourselves as we are if we're going to be able to improve as human beings. However, in order to achieve self-knowledge, something that human beings just by our very nature resist, that self-knowledge has to be brought to us through the vehicle of grace, natural and theological grace. But what O'Connor often distorts is the violence that's necessary for that grace to break into our lives. So, for example, in one of her stories, Greenleaf, the protagonist in that story only achieves self-knowledge in the moments in which she is gored by a bull and in the last moments of her life. In another one of her stories, one that's usually included in anthologies and taught in high school or colleges, the story is entitled A Good Man is Hard to Find. And this particular short story deals with the grandmother of a family who's self-centered, self-promoting, and because of that, she drives her family to disaster. And once again, in her case, she doesn't realize who she is. She's not able to receive that self-knowledge until the last moments of her life. And in this case, she's shot violently by a serial killer. Now, all those things could happen, but O'Connor piles it on. And so through that distortion, she's conveying to something to us that's incredibly important. She once complained that when readers complain about the grotesqueness in my stories, the violence in my stories, they are apprehending the wrong kind of grotesqueness, the wrong kind of violence. The grotesqueness they are missing is the extent to which we are all grotesque. And for that reason, the need that we have for intervening grace to achieve self-knowledge, but that means that a certain sort of violence is needed, at least in the cartoonish way in which she writes. We can momentarily consider the work of Franz Kafka. Again, someone that O'Connor made some comparison to in trying to explain her work, although she said in the final analysis, my work is different than that of Kafka. And in Kafka's work, you've got a real bending of reality. His best-known short story, of course, is Metamorphosis, in which an individual wakes up one morning to discover that he has become a roach, and he lives the rest of his days in that state. Now, we could sort of unravel or pull back all the layers of meaning that are captured in that short story, and you also have a certain amount of distortion in other short stories of his. A great short story of his is A Report to an Academy, in which an ape who has learned human speech is trying to explain to a group of scientists how he achieved it. But through that whole episode, the ape is teaching the audience something that they don't understand. But it takes this kind of creative exchange for Kafka to, in this case, convey to human beings that we aren't as free as we think we are. And until we realize that, then we will be prone to despair and will not be as productive and perhaps not even as happy as we might be. So if we apply these concepts again to comics and graphic novels, I think we can better appreciate the distortion that's involved, especially on the part of the artist, but in some measure on the part of the writer as well. So, for example, there are two graphic novels that should be paired and read together. One is entitled Mouse, and it's the story of the Jewish Holocaust. And in this case, the Jewish people are distorted in such a way that they're mice. And so the whole thing is anthropomorphic. But there is a lot of hidden meaning in that. And for example, it reminds us that one of the poisons that was used against the Jewish people in the concentration camps was rodent poison. And so just looking at the pictures as well as reading the script, you come to realize that the way in which this is distorted conveys much more than we might be able to understand were it not for that distortion, and if we were reduced to only watching a documentary or reading a news report. So that graphic novel then ought to be paired with another graphic novel by Joe Sacco, which is entitled Palestine. And in this case, it's the tables are turned, and it's about the Jewish occupation of Palestine. And the artwork in this particular novel is poignant. Everyone looks distorted, not just the Jews, but the Palestinians as well. And so the author and the artist in this particular case are saying something not only about the suffering of the Palestinian people during this occupation, but also because of the general way in which everyone is depicted through the artwork. He seems to be telling us something about the limitations and even the ugliness of human nature. So the novel is far more universal than we might appreciate when we first read it.